Hello everyone, I'm Anders Hejlsberg, a technical fellow at Microsoft, and I'm here to talk about TypeScript 7, the project that we just released. It is our native code port that makes our compiler and tools 10 times faster. The TypeScript project started about 14 years ago today, and TypeScript was always about improving JavaScript developer productivity by adding static types and then using those static types to enable great tooling. We've been open source from day one, and our community has grown really large. In fact, we average just under 1 billion downloads now on NPM monthly. And less than a year ago, TypeScript became the #1 programming language on GitHub. Now, if you'd asked me 10 years ago if I ever thought that was going to be possible, I would have told you no. But it's obviously very humbling and very motivating for our team. Now, with a community that large, people write a lot of projects, and some of these projects are very large. For example, one of our sister projects, Visual Studio Code, is 1.3 million lines of code in almost 8,000 files. And projects like that can take a while to compile and type check. And let me show you what that looks like. And on this machine here, I've installed both TypeScript 6 and TypeScript 7 side by side. And I'm going to use the old compiler, TypeScript 6, to compile the entire Visual Studio Code project, and then we can talk while that happens. Now, from the start, TypeScript was self-hosted, meaning it's written in itself. And that was a great benefit to us in the beginning because we were using the tool day to day and was feeling on our own bodies, what was right, what was wrong. But it also means that our compiler runs as a JavaScript app, and that has brought about some performance and scalability problems. JavaScript was optimized for writing UI in the browser and not really optimized for compute-intensive workloads like compilers that we write. In fact, the most commonly reported issue we see, if it's not performance, it's out of memory. So about 2 years ago, we first started an experiment and then a committed project to move the entire toolset to native code in a language called Go. TypeScript 7 is the result of that effort, and it is by far our biggest release in a decade. Here's how dramatic the improvements are. We average about 10 times perf improvement. Half of it comes from being in native code, up to half of it, I would say, and more than half of it comes from having access to shared memory concurrency. And I should mention here that the speed improvements we're talking about, this is speed improvements to our tools, not to the running code. But, often projects brag about a 30% speed improvement, but 10x is truly a game changer. I mean, this is really dramatically changing the productivity when you're working on large projects. Now, it's particularly interesting, the gain that we get, I think, from concurrency. I'm sure you've all noticed that, the free lunch is over in that Moore's Law is no longer giving us faster cores, it's giving us more cores. This machine, for example, has 16 cores. And, the way to get faster in the future for compute-intensive workloads is to use all of those cores as opposed to just one of them. Now, TypeScript 7 is a port of the TypeScript 6 code base. It's the same code, the same structure, with the same algorithms and semantics, just moved to a different language. And that means our behavior is 99.99% the same as the old code base, which is great for compatibility. You should expect to see this work exactly the way TypeScript 6 did, minus a few little details. Now, let's try to go back and look here. And so compiling Visual Studio Code took about 50 seconds. Now I have, as I said before, I also have TypeScript 7 installed on this box. And let's try to compile now with, let me just say tsc-no-emit/diagnostics and compile with the native code compiler. And we should see this go a whole lot faster. In fact, it completes in about 6.5 seconds here. And that comes out to 7.5 times. Now you're going to go, but didn't you say 10 times? Well, I did. And I'll show you where the difference there. But first, let me just mention here that in this compilation, every phase of compilation used concurrency. For example, all of our parsing, binding, and emitting happened concurrently. Each file was processed side by side with other files. And in the type checking phase, we actually by default spin up 4 type checkers and run them concurrently and have them each check a quarter of the files. And that's how you get better perf in that phase. But this machine here, as I mentioned, actually has 16 cores. So we can do even better. And so let me try to ask it to compile, but this time create 12 type checkers. So use like 3/4 of all of my cores for type checking. This, of course, will steal perf from other jobs running, but if there are no other jobs running, you might as well get them all going. And here you see we're down to like 4.5 seconds. So now we're talking about 12x. And in fact, this uses about the same memory as the old compiler did using that, but it took 10 times longer. In fact, one of my favorite screen grabs is this one, which is a 32-core, 128 gig machine, build machine, compiling a 15 million line code base in TypeScript. And you can see here for the screen grab, it's keeping every core busy. Now, with the old compiler, you would see one green bar here, and all of the other CPUs would sit around waiting. And that's what I mean by, you get the gain from concurrency. Now, it's great to have faster command line builds, but of course, arguably the language service is what's most important. And let me try to start up Visual Studio here. The language service in TypeScript 7 switches to use the LSP protocol, the language server protocol. This doesn't really show up in day-to-day use by you. However, it means that it's a lot easier to integrate this language service with other editors, and increasingly AI uses LSP also to do semantic validation of the code that it generates. Now, on this machine here, you'll see that I have TypeScript 7 installed as an extension. Eventually, TypeScript 7 will be the default, but we are still, when you install Visual Studio, you get TypeScript 6, and then you can install the extension, and the two will coexist. Now, you can see down here in the gutter that we're currently using the native language server. And with this language server, pretty much every operation is instantaneous. Like, let me try to say find all references for some of these identifiers here. And as you can see, it's practically instantaneous. Let me make a syntax error and you see red squigglies appear super fast. In fact, just to illustrate how quickly this new language server is, I'm gonna restart the language server, which kills the executable, restarts it, brings it back, parses 8,000 files and shows the red squigglies. And you saw this took like less than 2 seconds. And just to sort of show you the difference, let's try to disable TypeScript 7 and go back to TypeScript 6. And here you'll see, now we're grinding away. This takes about 10 to 12 seconds for the old language service to become responsive. So this is the difference between the two, and this means whenever you're working on big projects, you start your IDE, it's pretty much there right away. TypeScript 7 is heavily battle tested. In fact, for the last year, we've been publishing native previews, and we've had a lot of industry partners that have used TypeScript 7 in this preview phase, given us feedback and reported back, to us what the issues were. And so we're talking about a piece of code here that is very, very stable at this point. And you should expect to see dramatic performance improvements. I would definitely recommend that you use TypeScript 7, except if you have a code base that relies on using the compiler APIs. This would mean, for example, if you're using Vue or Astro, Svelte, or Volar, still you need to use TypeScript 6. That's why they can coexist here. But we're working with the industry and with our partners to build a new native code API and an API that you can call a cross-process for the new compiler. And that will ship in 7.1. But if you don't need the API, absolutely, I think you should switch to TypeScript 7 and enjoy all the free time you're going to get from these improved performance. Thanks.